In this video, I'll be going over the rotation for the Hypercarry Raiden team. As the name suggests, this is a team that focuses on buffing Raiden as much as possible and then dealing most of the damage during her burst while she's on the field. This is one of the more straightforward rotations in the game, which makes this team really consistent and easy to pilot. That having been said, I wouldn't especially recommend this team to newer players because it does require a lot of resources to build. There aren't really any budget or utility supports in this team, and every character's effectiveness does depend on their own stats. This is a really good example of a team where you get out exactly however much you put in terms of investment. This is a good team for endgame players who have the resources to build it and are looking for a team that's not too mechanically intensive. The main downside of this team is the accessibility, since it does require both Raiden and Kazuha, who are of course both limited 5 stars. You can use a different Anemo character in Kazuha's place, but you are going to lose a lot of damage. He really is the premier support for mono element teams like this, where most of your damage is coming from a single element. Now that you have an idea of how the team works, let's take a look at the rotation. The rotation ends when Sara catches the energy particles from Bennett and we're ready to use Kazuha's burst again. Now let's take a closer look. We open the rotation with Raiden's skill, which acts as a consistent source of electro damage and energy. We follow that up with Kazuha's skill and burst, which trigger electro swirl reactions. This does a couple of things. The first is decreasing the enemy's electro res thanks to Viridescent Veneerer. And the second is boosting the team's electro damage thanks to Kazuha's A4 passive. The electro damage buff scales off of Kazuha's EM, so build as much EM as you can on him. Next, we use Bennett's skill and burst, which provides healing and a huge attack buff to the on-field character. The attack buff scales off of his base attack, so make sure he's using a weapon with a high base attack. Then we use Sara's skill and burst, which also grants an attack buff to the character who comes on after her. The attack buff is triggered by a feather that she leaves on the ground after using her skill or burst. The burst always generates a feather, and the skill generates a feather if you have her at C2 or above. The feather detonates shortly after it's generated, and the attack buff is granted to the character that's nearby when it detonates. Because of this, it's important to swap to Raiden quickly so that she's on the field when the feather detonates. This attack buff also scales off of Sara's base attack, so you also want to use a high base attack weapon on her. And finally, if you have her at C6, the feather additionally grants a big crit damage buff, which helps Raiden's damage even more. Finally, we take the field with Raiden and use her burst to deal a very powerful initial strike. All the buffs that we've set up to this point are stacked on Raiden, which is what allows her burst to deal so much damage. Throughout the duration of her burst, these buffs will start to fall off one by one, so you'll see the damage dropping quickly. While her burst is active, try to perform 3 normal attacks followed by a charge attack, and then repeat that 2 more times. And then do 1 normal attack followed by a charge attack. If you do it quickly enough, you should be able to get that last charge attack in just before her burst ends. But a lot of times it can be hard to pull off the full combo, especially if the enemies are moving around a lot. After her burst expires, we use her skill to refresh its duration before swapping away from her. And finally, I like to end the rotation with 1 more cast of Bennett's skill, just to generate a little more energy while we wait for cooldowns. After I use this skill, I swap to the character who has the most trouble getting their burst back up. For my team, this happens to be Sara, but it could be a different character for you depending on the builds and ER that you have on each character. After catching Bennett's particles, we're ready to start the rotation again with Kazuha's skill and burst. Let's walk through the rotation one more time. Kazuha burst, Bennett burst and skill, Sara's skill into burst, Raiden burst, 3 normal, 1 charged, 3 normal attacks, 1 charge, and 3 normal attacks, 1 charge. Refresher skill, Bennett skill, catch the particles with Sara. For ER requirements, I recommend about 220 to 230 on Raiden, about 180 on Kazuha, and about 200 on both Bennett and Sara. This is a pretty energy hungry team because we really do want to use every burst, and the rotation is pretty tight, so we don't have a lot of time to recharge. That's all I have to share for this team comp. The builds are in the video description, and as always, thank you so much for watching.